Hello and welcome to the stunning conclusion of Adolescence. I feel like I've been talking about this subject for hours because there's so much here, or it could just be that adolescence never ends. I know I got a son right now. I feel like he's been an adolescent for years and he's still giving me a hard time. Ha ha ha. No, it's just kidding. But yes, adolescence is a big chunk of our life. It's a big period when our brain is growing exponentially. We're learning all kinds of cool stuff. We're capable of abstract thinking. We're trying to be all independent in our identity and go out in the world on our own. We're getting smacked in the face with all the body stuff like hormones, which is driving our behavior. There's just so many things that are going on we have to consider. But onward and upward, when it comes to sleep, I can tell you right away that adolescents never get enough of it because they're up far too late and they have to wake up far too early. There's always been those talks about should we push school forward just to account for the actual circadian rhythm of adolescence that might differ from somebody who's 70 years old and gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning, for example. So there are some questions there, but adolescents in general need about 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. Are they getting enough? Once they hit middle school, it's all over. They're up playing their video games till the wee hours and watching Law and Order till 4 o'clock in the morning. On average, adolescents sleep only 7.5 hours per night, again, which is not enough. They need a little bit more than that. If you don't get enough sleep, what tends to happen, again, you have these depressed moods, feeling tired, being sleepy, cranky, irritability, falling asleep in school, drinking too many caffeinated beverages to stay awake. You're already hitting that coffee and the Red Bulls in high school. It's all over after that. But the other big things you have to think about is the brain processes themselves. What happens when you're sleeping? For example, if you're studying for an exam, sleep is the most important thing. So if you study a little bit, get a good night's sleep, study the next day, get a good night's sleep, study the next day, get a good night's sleep, that gives your brain time to take those short-term memories and store them as long-term memories. And so we often don't think about the importance of sleep when it comes to memory encoding, which is associated with knowledge retention. But again, why do babies sleep so much? To answer the question of why do babies sleep so much, we have to look at how much time babies' brains are spending encoding all the stimuli that they're receiving from the social world, okay? So again, sleep is important not only for our emotions and our feelings and things along those lines, but it's also exceptionally important when it comes to brain growth and brain development also, okay? So just some things to think about. Again, what happens if you don't get enough sleep? Work, homework, media, technology, socializing, all of these things are happening. The adolescent brain, again, is a factor. Well, also, while you're sleeping is when your brain and your body actually grows too. So as we're going through puberty, for example, it's during your sleep when your body releases all of these changes. It's during your sleep when your actual physical body grows, okay? So again, your body's changing. The children are have to adjust to this. There's just so much happening in their world, yet they're never getting enough sleep. So when it comes to cognitive development, again, adolescence is a time of rapid cognitive development. What's going on here? Again, we've gone past that point where we're just kind of stuck in our own worlds and we're able to put ourselves in other people's shoes. We become aware of how the peers and other people are thinking about us. We become aware of the looking glass self, the idea that, how we can see ourselves through the eyes of other people. We're also formulating our identity at these times also. You also have incredible biological changes in brain structure and connectivity, meaning these neural pathways are really starting to solidify. And I often like to think about it like a systems of interstates across the United States, for example. You have things like Highway 40 and Highway 70 that are very efficient interstates that can take you from the East Coast to the West Coast without a whole lot of blockage, but it wasn't always that way. Prior to us having these interstate systems, these efficient neural pathways, our modes of communication or our ability to get across the Americas, for example, took a lot longer. And so what happens as you're entering adolescence and going into adulthood, especially as your brain is really fine tuning that map in your brain. I mean, think about all of your knowledge, all of your memories, all of your processes like a map on a brain and how it's all organized, right? And so from birth up until now, your brain is really just organizing itself, orienting itself to take in the information that you're being culturally socialized into, for example. But the way it does that is through a schematic map. So I often like to think about like a city, and each skyscraper is like a memory bank. And then think about an entire country of cities comprised of memory banks. And then we have these neural pathways or interstates that connects them all. And that's the best way to think about your brain. And so once you hit adolescence, you start to get more into the finely tuned brain, where your brain itself is becoming solidified. Not that you're not flexible and that you're not malleable and that you can't change, but at the same time, your crystallized knowledge is really starting to be there. And, essentially you're becoming a very well-rounded person, and your brain is organized and things are starting to make sense and you're able to function, right? And so look what happens when somebody enters high school and they're turning 14, 15, 16. They're like little adults, they have the abilities to drive cars, they have the skills to do mathematics, they know how to go to work and do jobs. They might not have like the incredible crystallized knowledge that you're going to get over a lifespan. As you continuously learn new information, you get better and better at your skills, and you fine tune your skills to the extent that it takes less steps to achieve tasks. But again, they are getting to that point, okay? So improvements in basic thinking abilities generally occur in several areas, okay? And so what are these areas aside from the brain growth? We're looking at attention. Improvements are seen in a selective attention, the process by which one focuses on one stimuli by tuning out on another, as well as divided attention, the ability to pay attention to two or more stimuli at the same time. Memory, we're seeing vast improvements in memory and working memory and long-term memory. And again, you can just think about your memory as like a country full of cities and buildings, and each building is like a memory bank that's spread out across your brain, because that's how it works. And then also processing speed. Again, your neural pathways are becoming more efficient. Your interstate systems are becoming more efficient. Adolescents think more quickly than children. Processing speed improves sharply between age 5 and middle adolescence, and levels off around age 15. And then again, by late adolescence and adulthood, we just all start to chill out a little bit. And then by the time you're 30, you're like, all right, I can manage this world. But again, until you become like 30 years old, which we're about to start talking about in the next lecture, there's just a lot happening. You have to take in all the stimuli of the world. You have to figure it all out. You have to make sense of it. You have to find your way around in here. You have to learn to use language and other skills and tools during this time. And so, again, just think about how someone is a baby until they get into adolescence, and look at the radical changes that have occurred. Not only the biological changes and the shifts and developments in our bodies and our brains, but also our capacity to interact in the social context, our knowledge and skills, all of that grows so much during this time. And you can see just the effectual changes that occur. Look at how a first grader writes compared to somebody in high school. Look at how a college student writes compared to somebody in high school. You start to see these exponential levels of like climbing a mountain. And each grade that you get past, or each year that you grow, or each phase that you get through, it's like walking one step higher up the mountain. And then by the time you're hopefully an adult, you're at the top of that mountain, and then it's all downhill from there, because we all get old and then we have to die. So thinking. Okay, your book, this is just basically how it titles it. Thinking. What is actually happening in the adolescent mind? What has changed from when they were babies to when they were early childhood to now where they're in this middle childhood or adolescence? Okay, so here we start to develop formal operational thought. Okay, this movement from the ability to think and reason from concrete visible events to think hypothetically, meaning at this time is when you can start to think abstractly. I remember being in high school and reading books that had symbolism. And whenever I heard, like, when I would just discover, like, oh, the Grapes of Wrath is really just a parallel of some other story. And you're like, oh, wow, Or when I read Invisible Man, it's all this symbolic information that's across that book. And every time you're like, oh, wow. But again, I remember being in high school and having those epiphany moments, but I think that's because that was the first time I was able to really start thinking abstractly, hypothetically. What could happen? What do you see in the future? What do you see in the past? Get outside of your own head, look through somebody else's eyes. This is a time when you can start to do that, okay? Individuals can solve problems through abstract concepts like algebra. What is algebra but irrationality, meaning that I'm not even mean to say irrationality. It's just the way of looking at it. It's just the existential way of looking at it, since we're talking about abstract thinking and existentialist ideas. But the whole idea with mathematics is, what are algebraic like symbols, but things that we place meaning to. Like the symbols that you use in algebra, they don't actually have any meaning in nature. It's us who applies meaning to these lines on a piece of paper or lines on a computer or whatever it might be. And then we teach what that line means to a kid. And so a kid has to learn the rules of algebra using like A's and B's and C's and then some parentheses and some plus signs, and then somehow they have to make sense of what that means. But again, in order for you to do that kind of that complex math, you have to actually be able to think abstractly. And so you can start to see, why do we start to push things like geometry and algebra when you start to hit high school? Because this is when their adolescent brains are actually able to use things that don't necessarily have any meaning in nature, and I use them abstractly to make cool concepts and play with numbers to make, prove things. Okay. So adolescents also use a trial and error to solve problems. They don't not only use inductive reasoning from bottom up, but they can do deductive from the top down, look at the big picture all the way to the small, and all the way from the small to the big, to be able to figure out problems in logical manners and methodical ways. You see a huge, again, improvement of skill in deductive reasoning, and then that leads to the development of hypothetical thinking, planning ahead. How do you think about big picture stuff? And I like to compare this when it comes to money. Like if you ask a 7-year-old to make change or to pay for something, they always start with the smallest things, like $1 bill or a $5 bill. They don't start with the 100 and then work their way down. But then once somebody becomes an adolescent, all of a sudden they start thinking about it like, I'll use a 20 or I'll use 100, instead of like counting all their small bills to see if that actually makes sense. Okay. And so what you start to see here also, which is a little bit more complex and maybe outside the realm of this lecture, is the dual process model, in that the brain is both unconscious and conscious. And you have to ask, when does somebody truly begin to start to be able to use their conscious mind? Children, when they're young, they're almost just like on instinct. If we actually had instinct, aside from maybe like suckling or reaching our hand out or something along those lines. But at what point, does the conscious mind start to take over? So when you start to teach things like the dual processing of the brain, the unconscious mind is pretty much driving the car all the time. You're not conscious even if you're awake, for example. Consciousness is something that evolved over millennia to help humans survive. It's an evolutionary adaptation. Our ability to step back, reflect upon situations, ponder, ask ourselves, how am I feeling? You got to ask, why are you able to ask the question, how am I feeling? The question, how am I feeling, comes from your unconscious mind and the hippocampus, for example, sending neural information using neurotransmitters to your conscious mind, the outer part. And so generally you feel first before you think. The consciousness evolved for us to reflect upon, what am I feeling? So for example, if you're feeling fear, instead of just responding to that fear, humans have the ability to step back and ask themselves, what am I afraid of? Why am I having this feeling? Why do I feel scared right now? And so that is the conversation that you're constantly having in your head. So if you compare something like Freud's theory of, the id, the ego, and the superego, the id is like your unconscious mind, that biological self, that pure you that's just spewing to get out. Your superego is like that awareness, like your conscious mind, your social self, your ability to step back and imagine yourself from these different places. And that voice inside your head, that's the ego. And the ego is essentially just your unconscious mind having a conversation with your conscious mind. And that's super weird to be able to think about, but it's around the time when somebody is in adolescence that they start to become in tune with this. You become more aware. That sense of awareness that you're developing, that's your conscious mind, okay? That's what your book is referring to, this metacognition. So your book says that at adolescence, metacognition kicks in, and it's called thinking about thinking. Okay, so metacognition, thinking about thinking. But that's again your unconscious mind talking to your conscious mind. And your brain actually has a specific neuron that's involved for that process. You have neurons, types of neurons that are used for your nervous system, which is your brain talking to parts of your body. You have your endocrine system that uses hormones, which are similar to neurons releasing chemicals just like neurotransmitters. And then your brain has another type of neuron that's just for inner brain conversation. So again, your brain has neurons that talk to themselves. They all just hang out in your head and they have conversations, okay? So adolescents are more aware of their own thought processes and they can use these devices and strategies, to start to think about what's going on in the world, to be able to reflect, okay? So again, this ability, then your book calls it relativism, but it's that ability of teens to start to question everything. Like earlier, my son, I was trying to be like, hey, go spend some minutes with your sister, and he's all like, why can't I do it tomorrow? But again, that's him thinking outside the box, and I'm proud of him because that's that relativistic, him just like starting to question, why does he have to go hang out with his sister instead of just listening to what I'm saying and just following the rules, for example? And so, again, straight out of your book, adolescents may even start questioning things that took place when they were younger. They're asking questions about what actually happened when they were kids. They're questioning everything. And then when you hit college, you really hit that point of questioning everything in life, but we're not there yet. So egocentrism comes up in the book here. Adolescent egocentrism is used by David Alkine to describe the phenomenon of adolescents' inability to distinguish between their perception of what others think about them and what people think in reality. And again, this is during that time when adolescents are at that point where they can put themselves in other people's shoes, but it's really, really new to them. Okay, so when an adolescent's walking down the world, they kind of think that like everybody's aware of them and they're all watching them, right? And your book talks about this imaginary audience, right? And the imaginary audience is like you're so in your head and you're like, what is everyone thinking of me? Do they like me? How do they feel about me? That your book just basically says adolescents are just walking around like, with this imaginary audience and they think everyone's watching them and they're always on their toes and things like that. And so your book talks about the personal fable, which describes this notion that it's the complement of the construction of an imaginary audience, and then invincibility fable is the belief in personal uniqueness. And so again, we all have this idea that everybody's watching us and that we're all unique and people are paying attention to us, but we actually go out and do these studies. It turns out that nobody's actually thinking about you. They're too busy thinking about themselves. And so it's really funny that we always pinpoint, adolescents as these like self-centered, just can't get out of their own head kind of people. But it turns out that we're all like that forever. And so, you always have to kind of, like the book talks about how we critique adolescence as a time of storm and stress, or a time when everybody's just so caught up in themselves that they're not considering others. And I don't really think that's actually the case at all. I think adolescence, the thing is, why is it built into us to care about what other people think about us? So if we're actually asking what is egocentricity all about, it's our awareness of ourselves, and then our awareness of ourselves interacting in the social world with other people who have a perception of ourselves. And I think it goes down to this idea of group membership and that humans are social creatures. And because we are social creatures, we want people to like us. If they like us, then they'll let us be part of our group. If they don't like us, then they'll exclude us from their group. And if we're excluded from the group, we're less likely to survive as a species or as individuals. And so again, group inclusion is very important to us. So over millennia, our brains have evolved the ability to be aware of what other people are thinking about us, but also to care about what other people are thinking about us. Why are teenagers so obsessed with this idea of what people think of them? It's because we all are. We want to belong to a group, but to a teenager, this is brand new. Like this awareness that other people are aware of them. Okay, that becomes completely new. And so you're always, that's why like the clothes are so important at that time in your life, or what other people think of you, or not embarrassing yourself in school, for example, because we're all kind of secretly obsessed with what other people think about us, and we really care what other people think about us, and how other people think about us affects the way that we think about ourselves. More specifically, our perception of how we think other people feel about us influences our perception of ourselves. And again, this is when you get into areas of like stigma research, when people internalize negative social attitudes about society and then they apply those negative attitudes to themselves, that can affect things like self-esteem and things along those lines. And so, teenagers, this is a hard time for them because the ones that don't fit in, that aren't the popular kids or whatever it might be, how does that psychologically affect them? Does that cause things like stress and anxiety and things along those lines? And it's also this time when people start to really express those kinds of emotions more deeply. And again, that a lot of that just comes from awareness. Like we have to learn to be in our bodies and to work in our minds and to learn what it's like to be human, right? And then we have to get along with all these other humans. And we're all just trying to get around in this world and be happy and have the things we want and have other people like us. But does it always work out that way? And so, yes, we're all a little bit self centered, but we're not as self-centered as you might think. And whether or not you kind of outgrow that and become, more, I don't know if you want to say altruistic over age, if that comes with wisdom, I'm not totally sure. But again, nobody can really ever get out of their own head. Of course, we're all egocentric in one way, shape, or form. That's why Freud's talking about that ego, that voice inside our head. But it's at this time where adolescents have that voice inside their head, and that voice inside their head is telling them things, right? Like, have you ever had like done really good on a test and all of a sudden your unconscious mind is all like, "You're so smart, you did so good," and you're like, "Unconscious mind, why are you building me up right now?" But that's kind of what actually happens. Like you yourself build yourself up. But how we build ourselves up a lot is how we measure like our success and whether or not people like us. And so we base who we are as people on these concepts. And so, I don't know, is it really an imaginary audience or is it really a real audience? I mean, adolescents are out in the world now. They're in these schools, they're in the education system, they're in the workforce. They are perfectly aware that other people are aware of them, okay? And then the other side that your book, delves into, just to conclude this part of, is this invincibility fable that nothing's going to happen to me. And again, that's what we talked about in the last lecture, part 2 of this series, is that our motivations during these times are really, peaked. And so we're very excited and we're curious and we're going out in the world. But our prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for our higher level executive functioning, is not fully developed. So, again, the idea is, are adolescents making the best decisions? Probably not at times. They're listening to that inner self a little bit too much, their unconscious minds taking over a little bit, their higher level executive functionings, that super ego is not checking their behavior, and it's not as concerned with safety during this time in our lives. And your book comments on why that is. But again, the more we think, does it also kind of block us? Because if we're not thinking about it and we're just like, the heck with it, let's get out in the world, are we more likely to have babies? Or it's just silly little questions that we were talking about last time. So again, risk taking, feeding into that invincibility. You know, Are adolescents more likely to take risks? Yes. And again, it's just that whole idea that part of your brain doesn't really develop till you're like 25, right? So that really good decision making judgment part of your brain doesn't develop till you're 25. That's why I was joking in my last lecture about, should we all wait to get married or make some big life career decisions until we're 25, because are we really thinking clearly until then? And again, you're up until then, you're thinking at capacity is the best way to say it. But your capacity for making good decisions arguably doesn't develop until your brain fully develops that part of your brain that's required to make good decisions. And so again, adolescents during this time, their bodies are going crazy, their hormones are screaming out for action, and they're out in the world. And so are they doing more risk taking? So, again, your book says, if adolescents weren't willing to take risks, would they ever leave the house, for example? And so, is it in our biology to go out and take some risks, to test the elements, to, force us to, challenge and grow? You know, that's just questions that we have to ask, okay? I don't know. I really think a lot of this is evolutionary psychology can be applied here across the board. And I think it's perfect in a developmental psychology class. Evolutionary psychology is not really something you're going to talk about in this class because it's a little bit more higher level when, psychology. And so this only being a developmental class at a 200 level. But it's, a good time to introduce these ideas of how has our bodies and brains evolved over time. And then how have things like motivation and desire, like what do you crave? What do you want? What do you need? How is this built into us? And we seek this out. And it's our conscious mind and our bodies, even before our conscious mind. I mean, your unconscious mind and your bodies are driving you to go find food, to go find sex, to go find shelter, to go make friends, to go call your mother. And you might not think about that your unconscious mind is telling you to call your mom, but think about it. Like, do you ever have just an impulse to go call someone? Where does that impulse come from? Where does that impulse to go be social come from? A lot of that is your unconscious mind. When you want sex, your body releases hormones into your bloodstream, which travel to your brain. And actually, your body is telling your brain, I want sex. But your brain can also tell your body, I want sex, by thinking about it. And so it's very complex, hence the dual processing nature of the brain. It goes both ways, from the mind to the body to the brain, from the unconscious mind to the conscious mind, from the conscious mind back down to the unconscious mind. Again, it's incredibly complex. But again, what are the evolutionary benefits for having it so our brains don't fully develop until we're 25, but our desires kick in, our hormones kick in before that ever happens? And again, that's when your book gave that, teenagers would never have the motivation or the confidence to even leave their family, and me joking about whether you not want kids or not, because I'm an older parent. So, the older you get, the more you realize that having kids is a lot of work. And when I was younger, it was a little bit blurry. I was far more like energetic and, but as I got older, I mean, maybe I wasn't as energetic and I got more tired, I just did, I got tired or something. I got perma tired. I didn't feel that way when I was young. So that's why I always joke around, does your body want you to always make the best decisions? Or does it want you just to go buck wild and go out there and have some fun and make some babies? And then before you know it, meaning before your brain actually fully develops, you've already reproduced and you've done all of these things, right? So again, that's just me thinking about some silly concepts, but I do really like it. I mean, I'm just joking that it's silly because to me, it's actually pretty darn real. I wonder about that kind of thing, because you have to ask, why does it take so long for that part of your brain to develop? Is it just that how much time we need, or is it built in like that for a reason? Okay. Um, so regarding the education system, again, we've talked a lot about in this class, agents of socialization. We've talked about your primary agents, like your parents, your siblings, and then, your peers over time, which becomes really important during, middle childhood and adolescence, especially. But then the education system really starts to kick in here. I'm not going to give a giant lecture about how the education system structures us. It structures our cultural way of life, our attitudes, ideologies, belief systems, and all of that. But again, we have to recognize that children spend so much of their time in the education system that whatever that environment is, the stimuli that is occurring in the education system is directly influencing the way they think. Not just the way they think, but the type of and the way their brain is actually structured. So again, children that go to really super hard, challenging schools tend to have more brain growth than children that go to underprivileged, underpaid, not as challenging of schools. And again, when you teach theories of intelligence, like we've talked about in this class with Vygotskian theory and things along those lines, the education system is associated with the way your brain is structured and the way you think and your attitudes toward life. And it also structures things like your access, your skill sets, so it's pretty complicated. And so adolescents spend more waking time in school than any other context. And so we have to understand, how does the school environment influence you? Okay. Adolescents who complete primary education, learning to read and write, and continue on through secondary and tertiary education tend to have better health, wealth, and family life. Why is that? What's the correlation between development, overall outcomes in your life, and the education system? And again, to unpack that, it's a biopsychosocial process in that, your brain growing, the more it grows, the more it's challenged, the more you work that muscle, the more intelligent, the more capable you tend or should be, meaning that you also, because you have more skills, more knowledge, should have better access at getting jobs. And then when it comes to credentialing, education system gets you those credentials to get you that job, to get you that money. And if you can get yourself that money, you can get higher level socioeconomic status. The higher socioeconomic status you have, the more access you have to good schools for you and your kids. The better access that your kids have to schools, the better outcomes they have in the end. And so, again, there's direct correlations between things like socioeconomic status and intelligence. And it's not fair. It means that not every child is invested in. But again, we've already had this lecture, and I've talked about, how we not every kid has a chance to become Einstein or Lydia Sebastian because they're not invested in by others. And so again, we've talked so much throughout this class about the social investment, right? The more you invest in kids, does that get you a return in development? Do they grow stronger, smarter? The answer is yes, okay? And it's just, that's just part of it. And so it's sad to think that not every kid has a hug and someone that loves them and that they didn't eat today and they don't have a chance to go to a good school and they're not cared about. Because that's the pitfalls to development, right? What does a kid need to fully develop to not only be a successful citizen or a successful person in the social world? Not, I mean, again, however you measure success. I don't mean like material success, just whatever outcomes of success that we would have in general, but also for that kid to be happy. How do you raise a kid to be happy and successful by their own standards, right? What does that take? What kind of an investment? And what does it take physically and mentally? And that's the other side of it when it comes to things like things that block our development. Like this class doesn't focus on so much like developmental issues or things that we would label as developmental issues. But again, our brain capacity is only as good as our brain capacity. And so if you have developmental problems, for example, how is that associated with growth and development? And then how do we measure that success based upon that form of measure? And again, the idea is you can't measure every single kid the same. You can't measure every life the same. And not everyone has the same set of tools going into it. Again, that's the biopsychosocial approach, because dogs can only learn so much. Their brain is not capable of complex mathematics, but humans are. But a human can't do complex mathematics until they can learn the abstract thinking and what the symbols mean. And to learn the abstract thinking and what the symbols mean generally requires some kind of social investment so that you can unlock that part of your brain and get those neural pathways working, okay? So, adolescent identity, just to kind of finish out this lecture, we've got adolescent identity and self esteem and all these cool concepts just to close it out. This is an exceptional time for our identity formation. When you're talking about identity and the formation of the self, you always have to take a biopsychosocial approach because you are born with a genetic personality. Half of you is your genes. That's why you end up turning out like your parents, your aunts, your uncles, your sisters, your great grandmothers. You end up with similar mannerisms, same way you hold your body, similar ways of talking or telling stories. I mean, it's weird to think that like your genetics is associated with the way you use and manipulate language, but it is, okay? The things you think are funny, a lot of that stuff is just built into your biology. Yes, much of it's learned, but again, so much of who you are as a person is in your genes. But the thing is, you're not born knowing who that genetic you is. You spend so much of your life trying to figure out who am I? But the who am I question is a blend between your social self, the person you are out in the social world, or your multiple social selves that you express, and then that inner self. And again, going back to Freud's theory of id ego and superego, the id is your genetic self. That's like your inner self that, that true self. I don't know how else to put it other than that, right? And then your ego, your super ego, is that social self. That is all the potential yous that you could be in the world, right? And so adolescents at this time are trying on, I'll be a punk rocker this week, a skater that week. Again, they're trying on all kinds of shoes to see which one actually fits their true self. And so all of us are trying to find that balance between our inner self and our social self. And there's a great debate between psychology and sociology, in that sociology is all like the self only exists through social interaction. And psychology is all like you're kind of born with the true self, but yes, that does develop through social interaction. And so that's what's going on with adolescence, right? Like kids have been just their raw personality for a long time. Then all of a sudden they hit adolescence. And then they start to like have that conscious mind kick in. It becomes aware of the person that they're being, and then the person that they're supposed to be, and then the person that they actually want to be. And so, how do you find that balance between all of those? The person that you are, the person you want to be, and then the person you're supposed to be in this world that conforms to the cultural norms that you want to conform to without fighting and tearing down, for example. Okay, so Erickson breaks it down as the primary psychosocial task of adolescence is establishing this identity. And for me, I don't like the idea of establishing your identity. One, I like the idea of discovering who you are, who is your genetic self, and then establishing who you want to be and trying to become that person. But it's you can only become the person you want to be and be the person that you are so much as you can do that freely in the social context. And so here's kind of the balance, right? We can't all just let out our true selves because we have to conform to the norms of society or we're labeled deviant. And if we're labeled deviant, then we're excluded. Like all humans have it in us to be violent. Much of our true self is very violent in nature, but violence is not acceptable in the social world. So even though you might be a violent person on the inside, as humans are, we have the ability to hit, kill, go to war, commit genocide. The things that humans can do that are bad just go on forever. But that side of us is highly molded by the social context, right? That sense of morality is both a psychological phenomena and that we have a sense of, what we think is right and wrong, but also a social phenomena in that we are molded to follow the rules of society. And so who you are and the person you express has to follow the rules of society or you're not going to be accepted. So again, I like this phase because it's all about kind of balancing all of these processes, right? You're exploring the person that you think you could be. You're exploring the person that you are. You're getting to know that person, but you have to explore that within the confines or the social controls of society, okay? And so whether or not we commit to an actual identity during adolescence is completely arguable. But you can see where our identities have been solidifying really for a while. Like once a kid starts to hit 5, 6, 7, 8, like you can really see the personalities start to shine. And then you see adolescence is when they make kind of more the decision to be that person. Like I want to be this person, right? And so your book talks about a couple concepts like identity diffusion, right? A status that characterizes those who have neither explored their options nor made a commitment to an identity. So adolescents who are struggling or not even asking that question yet are going through identity confusion. Identity foreclosure is when you've made a commitment to the identity without ever exploring options. So some people are like, that's the person I'm supposed to be. I'm just going to be fine with that. The heck with it. Identity moratorium is the person who is actively exploring their identity and they're constructing an identity, but they're not totally committed to it yet. And then identity achievement is when you have finally made the commitment to the person you're going to be for the rest of your life. The way I see it is we're all kind of doing this all the time. And I don't think that our identity ever fully solidifies. Our self is constantly evolving. Yes, just like I was saying earlier with the neural pathways. Like when you gotta over time you get to adolescence, your brain becomes like a really detailed map. The highways are very strong. You don't have a lot of excess streets going off in nonsensical directions, right? Your identity is kind of like that. Like you are becoming the person you are becoming in adolescence no matter what. But you're still trying on new shoes. But again, I think we do this throughout our life. Like, what happens when someone has a career change and they're trying on new shoes? Or what if you're just like, I'm unhappy with the person I've been forever. I'm just going to go be something else. Like, you can do that at any time in your life. But there is this sense of coherence and integration into who we are at that time in adolescence. You start to see that formulation of our identity, our sense of self starts to become much more solid. And you know what? That's probably a good thing because to have some predictability in yourself is not the worst thing ever. So, facets of identity development, again, we've talked about the biopsychosocial approach, the balance between your genetic inner self versus the thoughts and cognitions and emotions about who you want to be, along with the conscious reflection about who you want to be, and then how the society, not only agents of socialization, but other institutions of social control that definitely structure how you express your identity, what kind of behavior is acceptable in the social world. So again, when we're thinking about things like temperament, that is like your inner true self. Like what is your overall emotional and cognitive state? Your personality is that balance between the social context and the, kind of your temperament. That's the person that you are that people see, right? But then we have to think about how other things influence our identity, such as the groups we belong to. So, like, this is much more sociological in nature, but if you're studying sociology, you're going to be asking questions like how does your racial group or your gender or your socioeconomic status structure your personality and your identity? Because they do. Like, depending upon the race that you get socialized into, that structures how you talk, walk, think, and dress. And if you look at how races have segregated and race-based cultures have different ways of life, you're going to see that behavior and personalities will differ in these different social contexts because we all conform to the groups that we belong to. Like when I'm teaching sex and gender, like we talked about a few weeks ago, again, are boys and girls different because we're biologically different, or is it because we're socialized to be different? Once you figure out the group you belong to, or you've been told you belong to that group, you conform to the ways of that group, right? You figure out the social norms. If you're born a boy, you're like, okay, what do other boys do? And then you conform to that way of life. And so when you conform to the groups that you belong to, that's actually conforming the way your brain is structured and things like your personality and your identity. Okay, so it's super complex, but that's the biopsychosocial, right? Biology, your genetic self, then the brain structure, psychology, your cognitions, your thoughts, emotions, your motivations. Who am I? Asking that question in your head. And then how the social world, the social context structures your personality and your identity. Hence, when we talked about things like the education system is an institution, but within this institution, you have all these agents of socialization that are also structuring behavior. They're teaching you the rules. And by teaching you the rules, you then mold your personality to meet the rules. Right? All right. So to conclude this little section here, again, your authentic self versus your inauthentic self. That's for you to decide. You have to ask, the person that I am being, is this the person I want to be? And does this feel like me when I am being this person? If you can say yes, you're rocking it. If it's no, maybe you're still exploring and finding your way, or maybe you need to make some kind of a change. I don't know. I don't have any suggestions or advice. These are just questions. We all have our own process of discovering out who we are. One person's process is not going to work for somebody else. How do you figure out who you are? What does it take? Can you just decide and be like, that's who I am, I'm good with that? Or are you just constantly in flux and can you never figure it out? Or are you like, I pretty much know who I am, but I'm still open for new experiences. I'm open to evolve. I'm open to change. And again, our next lecture will definitely get into that. Because again, we are malleable over time. Just because we get old doesn't mean we can't change or evolve or be something different. And that's some cool conversations. But again, my next lecture we'll talk about this because like what happens if you're not your authentic self when you're 40, right? Oh crap, midlife crisis. I've been wasting my whole life. I don't like the person I am. I hate my career. What am I going to do? So you got to ask those questions. We'll talk about that next time. So again, self-concept and self-esteem. What does this really take? And so as we've talked about in the last time when I was talking about how adolescents are so aware about how other people feel about them. Self-esteem, belief in yourself, self-efficacy, self-competency, your sense of self-worth, it's a two-way street, right? It comes from you. It comes from your inner self and your decision like I like myself. I like who I am. I'm going to be this person. I'm cool. But it also comes from the social context because you are fully aware how other people feel about you. And you can't run from that. And even people that are all like, I don't care how anyone feels about me, they're lying through their teeth because it's in your DNA. You care. You just care whether or not you want to, okay? We also base how we feel on things like our romantic relationships. Why? Because we care about how other people feel about us, right? If you got someone who's totally into you and thinks you're freaking awesome and like loves you and wants to be with you, like, or same thing with friendships, your influence of your peers or social views. If you look around you and everyone thinks you're great and you think, you're great and you think they think you're great, then like you're just going to be all like, I'm great and believe in yourself. But what happens if you get stigmatized? And so again, that's why I introduced stigma earlier, because what if you belong to a minority group that commonly gets stigmatized, right? What happens if you internalize the negative attitudes about society? How does that affect things like your self-esteem? What if you're in school and something embarrassing happens to you? Or what if all the kids always make fun of you and bully you? How does that affect the way you feel about yourself? Okay. And so, again, having this positive environment is a good thing. Like, I don't know, like someone just committed suicide the other day. This pastor, he was in Alabama, North Carolina, Georgia, something like that, right? Somewhere in the South where they're very stigmatizing of cross-dressing. And it turned out that this pastor, who everybody in the town loved, got caught cross-dressing. Somebody got some photos and they published these photos, right? And this person was just so devastated because they just couldn't deal with how they thought everybody else would feel about them. So this person committed suicide, basically, because they got exposed. And again, that's what it's like. Like, we're all so scared to be exposed or have the truth of us come out, or have someone see us in a negative light. And that's why we have things like impression management and whole philosophies of dramaturgical, theory, is this idea that we're all actors on a stage and we're trying to put on this positive performance so that people like us and want to be around us. And in adolescence, this is just important. And whether or not it's important to you, it's important to adolescents. And we have to respect that. Like, we sometimes adolescents get made fun of because they're so obsessed with everybody cares about them. But again, why is that built into them? Why do they care? It's basic group behavior. Adolescents want to become part of the group. They want to fit in just like everybody else, okay? And so all of these things affect our general self-concept and self-esteem. Your book doesn't go into deep into other things like family life. How is that associated with self-esteem? Trauma, abuse, other factors that could be happening during this time. Okay, so again, there's a lot of bit of darkness and sadness. And then you also have things like basic brain chemistry. Like, is brain chemistry associated with things like self-esteem? It is. Like things like depression, anxiety, a lot of that is also brain chemistry. So we can't just always focus on things like the social context as the root of all problems that could negatively affect things like our self-concept and our self-esteem. A lot of that does come from internally. A lot of it does come from our own cognitions, our own experiences, okay? So again, it's a two-way street whenever we're talking about this kind of stuff. So again, I know these have been some extremely long lectures. I have tried to get through them in such a way that you guys don't get super bored. So I appreciate you getting through it. I mean, not that you would ever get bored because it's fascinating stuff, but I know it can be a lot to take on. And so this was a 3-part lecture, a good 2.5 hours of talking. And I still feel like I didn't even hit on half of the things I want to talk about. I could literally talk for days. I appreciate y'all. Have a wonderful day.